And we're here at Knobcon 2022 with Jim Coker of 512. Jim is the inventor of the much-loved Numerology step sequencer on the Mac, as well as the much-loved Vector hardware sequencer. Jim, I understand that we're going to be hearing about your live rig today.
Yes, I'm so lucky that I helped run the Chill Out Room, which we run Saturday night at Knobcon. We had a phenomenal lineup of 9 acts, an amazing show covering a wide variety of music, everything from quiet drones to heavy bass arpeggios to long melodic sequences, just some crazy beats. That was just amazing. And I had the honor and to some extent the burden of performing, which I took on readily. And I thought today, since I'm more relaxed, I'd set up my live rig and walk you through it a little bit because I'm using both the Vector and Numerology in it. And I'm integrating the Vector with a bunch of analog gear and some digital gear. So something that's new this year is Chris Meyer and I decided we would do our sets in quadrophonic sound. And our first quadrophonic show was in Santa Fe in June at the Currents Festival. And I wasn't able to perform, but Chris performed in quad along with David Soto of CMSS and Jill Frazier from California. And then this time, Chris and I performed in quad. And of course, the tricky part is how do you do the mix? And I tried a variety of things, and eventually I said, you know what? Numerology actually has amazing built-in audio routing, and I'm going to use it because, you know, I wrote the code, I know how to use it, and I know it can do this. So the first thing I did in Numerology, which is nominally stereo routing system, but there's also an alt bus, just like on mini mixers. And the routing within a stack or a part is fairly flexible. So I started by building up a quad panner algorithm based around the XXXY module to generate control signals, and then basically just some pan and volume modules and automated with an LFO. And you know, the routing is really fairly simple. And I was able to put this together in like 15 minutes after literally days of trying to find automated panning things for Ableton or Logic. And they're out there, and Chris uses Ableton and he gets a good mix, but I wanted something with a little more of the flavor of Numerology going.
And sorry, just to interrupt, this is all actually off the shelf. So a user of Numerology could follow in your footsteps and be able to create a quad panner in the same way right now.
Absolutely. This is Numerology Pro. These are all standard modules. I didn't have to write custom anything. I also set up a quadrophonic ping pong delay. So it starts front and center, goes to the right rear, the left rear, the right front, and then the left front. And my main bass ostinato is in 1/8 notes, but it's a 3/16 note delay, so you get this amazing syncopated action going, and it just spins around the room. And of course, it's got the mixer, so I was able to set up all my channels on the mixer. All the stacks in Numerology have 8 aux sends, and there are, I think, 12 or 16 internal buses. So I was able to set up reverb in the front, reverb in the back. I have 2 circular panners, and I had 1 quad ping pong delay. I almost used a second one, but didn't need to. And then in a couple of cases, I used, you know, this thing I call the coyote calls, and I have 2 Valhalla delays, one routed front, one routed rear, so that I could have this little like call coming out of a module and then have it repeated in all 4 corners. So it's just way more fun than like, oh, I have a circular panner and I'm going to spin things around the room, right? There's a lot of creativity there that people don't always see.
Without a doubt, and it was, as you know, I was lucky enough to be in the audience and I thoroughly enjoyed your performance. I absolutely loved it. And there is nothing, you can't explain how compelling a performance in quad is. You have to just sit in the middle and experience it. Absolutely. And realize how much power there is.
Absolutely. There. I mean, it pulls you into the sound field, and it is immersive. And it doesn't have to be difficult to set up. You know, you could get, you know, a couple pairs of little bitty speakers and set them around the room, and it can be fantastic.
from there?
So I've got a Claret ++ down here for my audio interface. The 4 inputs on the front are all coming from my analog voices. I also have a stereo pair coming from the HX Stomp. And then this area down here is what I call my guitar rig. I've got the Linstrument, because I love playing slide guitar type lines, going into the MC101 running a GR300 patch, tweaked a little bit, into the God Eater from Animal Factory for some fantastic fuzz, the HX Stomp for some delays, a wah pedal, and the speaker cabinet. So this runs stereo into here, and then I split it off for reverbs front and rear. Okay, over here, this is my modular rig. I've got my primary case here and a secondary case. The secondary case is a 2-oscillator mini mod voice. So this is my Moog bass line. Sounds amazing. I'm actually driving this from the Vector with 2 pitch lines. I basically treat it as a 2-voice chord. So I often I'll tune them in unison, but I usually run VCO2 an octave higher than the other. Sometimes I run it a 5th above. Sometimes I run it with the main oscillator as a steady drone and the secondary oscillator slowly moving in counterpoint. In my main case, I have another mini mod oscillator running into an SEM filter for 1 voice, 2 envelopes on the Quadra. I've got a Roland 510 as another voice, 2 more envelopes from the Quadra. This gig, I did something a little different. I'm using the filter in full resonance modulated from the Dixie, and I play this as a solo instrument. And then the oscillators I've stolen and sent to the Steiner VCF, and I use this as kind of a tambura type resonant drone, which is driven from this LFO, which I'll come back to in a minute. On the Vector, I have all the parts for all the sequencing. I could do the sequencing in Numerology, but for this it's all composed on the Vector. Part 1 is for this voice here, and I use it for kind of a high, kind of angelic sequence. Part 2 generates the pitches for the drone out of the Steiner. Part 3 I'm not using. Part 4 and Part 6 are controlling samples hosted in Numerology, because Numerology includes a sampler. And Part 4 is hitting Xenology Pro with a simple patch to simulate waves. Part 6 is hitting a sample I made in my studio of some rocks being tumbled in a towel that are then stereofied and duplicated out across many pitches to give this kind of rock tumble in the back speakers.
Beautiful.
Part 7 I use for strings, polyphonic strings, and those are also running in Xenology Pro, although I could easily run them in the MC101. I've done that many times. Part 8 is for drums. My drums are running in samples out of Numerology. Part 5 is my AGH mini mod voice, and I run this in chords. Let me get down to on the launch pad. I use the launch pad connected to the Vector to trigger all my presets. So when I'm performing, most of my arrangement is done here. I generally don't have to dive into the Vector at all. That's kind of my personal working method, because I spend a lot of time on the Linstrument, or for this piece, on the Roland 510. So I don't have a lot of literally time available to get into the sequencer, but there are a couple things I do dive into the sequencer for in performance.
I have a question about your
Yeah.
use of the Vector that way. So when I think about it, I'm thinking of it as a step sequencer, something in which it's playing a melodic part, over and over repetitively, but allowing you to be able to change it and have randomization and so forth. And to be sure, there was that in your performance. The bass line absolutely was that. But I also noticed, a lot of long, diaphanous kinds of samples that were being triggered and cloudy kinds of things, stuff that I wouldn't think a step sequencer would be used for. So I'm very curious how you oriented it that way and how you used it in that fashion.
It's a good point, right? Because people think step sequencers, are for fast, short ostinatos, and I don't think that way at all. It's a compositional tool, and if you've ever studied music or listened to music seriously, typically even large pieces are built off of fairly short melodies, and they're constantly evolving and changing and transposed. So One of the ways I describe the vector is it's a way to start with a musical fragment, even if it's randomized or generated, and then mutate it, expand it, work with it, experiment, throw the things out you don't need, keep the things you like. This piece, I had this idea of this long cycle of sounds over several bars, and it turned out to be 24 bars at a fairly fast tempo. We're at 137 BPM, but 24 bars over that is a fairly long cycle. And the beginning starts with a hit in the drums. Just one hit on a couple of samples. They're actually Lindrum samples I've repitched, running out of numerology with some reverb to get that really kind of distant impact type sound. Mm-hmm. And then after that, on part 4, cue up part 4, I've got a long note triggering the wave sound out of Synology Pro, and it's basically just two different noise voices. One's lower, that fades out, and one higher, that fades out. And then after that clears up, on part 6, I've got a chord part sending 4 notes, and it starts with all 4 notes and then slowly drops the higher notes over the course of several bars until just the lowest note is playing. And that's playing that tumbled rock sample that I have.
Right.
And that's coming out stereo only in the rear speakers with reverb in the rear and a little bit of reverb in the front. So that's the cycle, right? And that's this long cycle that starts the piece. And then I bring in the kind of tambura sound on the Steiner VCF, and I'm using a new module from 512 called the QVL, the Quad Variable LFO, and I'm using a chaotic waveform called the Lorenz attractor, which gives me this, and I'm running it very, very slow, but it gives you this long, undulating wave that generally just oscillates at a low level and then very occasionally gives you a few peaks and then goes back down. So again, very analogous to being on the ocean and having the waves come in.
Beautiful.
And then I run chords on part 7 out of the, part 5 out of the AJH. The piece is nominally, this part of the piece at least is nominally in C minor, and I'm running, this voice is always C. I'm sorry, this oscillator, the second oscillator ranges between a fifth, and a flat 6th, a 5th, an octave, minor 4th, major 4th. This is kind of the slow line going on in the background. And then later on part 1, I bring in this 7-note descending cycle that's kind of split between 2 different keys. And I use modulation on the length of the sequence so that it flips between a 5-step sequence and a 7-step sequence.
Great.
And then that's going into a ping pong delay that's, I think, set to either 2 or 4 16th notes. So you get this meshing effect, and that comes in from the background. And then there's like coyote voices here and some other sounds. There's a few background string pads coming out of part 7 for the chords. And again, here I've got part 7, I'm gonna get the right preset. It's just 3 chords running at a rate of 4 whole notes with a lot of space in between. And these are custom chords that are meant to be mildly dissonant and just kind of this diaphanous floating type of thing. And then from there, we start to build towards the main bass ostinato on part 5. Cue that up. This is an 8th note ostinato being fed into a quad ping pong delay at a 3/16th note, so you get this syncopated 16th note feel. And it starts with a very simple modulation just between C and A flat. And then it goes through a few different variations. It's actually over 8 different presets And there are little arrows here on the playlist, I'm sorry, little arrows here on the preset page because I've set up a full playlist. So as soon as I queue up preset 5 and the transport's running, it will cycle through that whole sequence over the course of about 3 minutes.
Wow. So just like the timeline in numerology, you have the ability within the vector to be able to take these smaller building blocks and then stretch them out into
and
much
build
longer
larger
pieces.
arrangements.
It's beautiful.
Because while this is happening, I've got my little scribble strip with the notes. I start soloing on the instrument, and I'm focused on that while the sequencer's taking care of everything else. And then towards the end of that cycle, I start fading out this voice, and I bring in a string patch I actually built in numerology, which uses 8 notes being driven by 8 different sequences, all at the same rate, but at different lengths. So I get this, again, kind of slow wave-like motion in the sings.
It's beautiful.
I bring in a different pattern on voice number 1. In this case, the dry signal is shut off, and it's all wet signal through Valhalla Shimmer, and you get the angelic choir type thing. I do one more solo on the instrument, in this case with a trumpet type voice, and a few coyote calls, and then we wrap up with just the tumbling rocks at the end.
It's wonderful. I have so many comments and so many questions, but I will start by just having the comment that the vector is so much more than a simple step sequencer. It is such a rich compositional tool, and it's beautiful to see the inventor using it in that way and using it with all of these different opportunities. The question that I have for you is, how long did it take you to compose this piece?
Off and on, but I'd say total, well, the first idea was probably be back in April or May, and I did a few basic things. I set up the 24-bar cycle with the rocks and the waves and the distant thump, and then I wasn't able to work on it for quite a while. And then about 2-3 weeks ago, I started on it in earnest, and I do like an hour or 2 a night. And a lot of it is because I'm really fascinated by this type of symmetrical scale built on major thirds. And I'm pretty much a novice when it comes to any kind of musical harmony. So I can watch a video and they can describe it and I can plug in the notes, but I have to experiment over and over and over again to find the tonality I'm looking for.
That's very wonderful.
So I was doing a lot of this iteration stuff, and I was slowly building up like this bass ostinato, right? And then building the patches in numerology for the quad ping pong. And then there comes the problem of like, okay, I have this amazingly heavy, fast bass line. What do I do on top of that? And tried a few sequency things, ended up going with the solos on the instrument. So it was, and then probably a big push last week, almost full time. Well, 6 or 7 hours a day as I could allocate it.
That's a lot.
Yeah, and then a couple days this week before Knobcon, basically just getting to where I could do full run-throughs, setting things up on the vector and the numerology so that I knew how to manage the transitions between different sections. And then one last panicked evening before I had to pack up for Knobcon, figuring out exactly what the solos were going to be and writing those out on a little piece of paper, which I had like right here, and
like you do.
practicing that and getting that done, and and it makes a difference, right? That was something that it kind of took me a while to figure out. It's like, oh, people that do this live all the time, they spend a lot of time doing run-throughs and practicing. It's 100%. Not like they just show up and slam their gear and like, yeah, I'm going to bust this out. It's like, no, they've been working hard for days to get ready for a show.
Well, Jim, thank you so much for giving us all of that expert information on your live rig. I think it's a fascinating deep dive into what you can really do with electronic music, and I know that our listeners will find it useful.
Thank you. It's lovely to be able to set it up here at Knobcon now that the gig is done and I can relax. And it was a great time, and it's great to be able to show the vector and numerology working together in the context for a composition. The sort of music I wanted to be able to make for years, and now I really have the tools I can explore that.
Well, I look forward to listening to your future works as well. Thank you again.
Thank you.